right, our final paper this afternoon for this session is Roger Newfield from Ottawa. Roger is a former PhD student of Brian's at Queen's University. For the past several years, he's been working with the Public Health Agency of Canada, focusing on First Nations health.
Not that it matters, but it's actually Health Canada.
Sorry.
I'll exclude fact from the responsibility of taking accountability for my mistakes. Like everyone before me, and at the risk of having this all rushed to his head and eventually becoming insufferable to be with, I'd like to thank Brian Palmer for inviting me here. I've been out of the business for a while, and it's a real, I feel like a 12-year-old. It's a bit of a treat to sit in a room and survey the brains and talent and accomplishment I see before me now. So I'm quite grateful for the opportunity. He does, however, take no responsibility for what mistakes I'm about to make as I make this presentation. The first of which is the title. I know I said I was going to talk about prostitutes in Winnipeg and the Winnipeg Press. This is a lie. I'm not going to say much at all about the Winnipeg Press. It'll be almost entirely about prostitutes. So let's just get underway. I do not want to make Jillian angry at me using up my time. I will start with a short vignette lifted from the Winnipeg Free Press. On a day in March in 1881, two girls, Fanny and Lucy, probably young women, although we don't really know, got into a cab, which being open and it being March must have meant either they were very drunk and or it was a very warm day in Manitoba in March, and they took an airing downtown from their bravos west of Main Street. They insulted some ladies, scandalized some men, did some shopping, raised a bit of a ruckus, went back to the red light district. Newspaper was outraged, talked about disreputable wenches. These women clearly had no common decency. They were flaunting their immorality in the face of the city, and we do not need this kind of insult to decent people in downtown Winnipeg. It was understood these women were supposed to be somewhere else. Fanny and Lucy were duly arrested, went to police court the next day, were probably in the process of paying their fines when two more women from another brawl, both of which are apparently well known, did exactly the same thing. So what do we learn from this very brief vignette? I think we can learn a few things. First, prostitutes were clearly disorderly. They were theatrical in all the wrong ways. And they were part of an underworld, dangerous or not, that just was unsavory, seedy, best never seen nor heard unless you had, apparently, specific business to conduct with it. Secondly, obviously, they violated a margin, or what John Merriman would call an urban frontier. They were meant to be in a certain place. They were not there. As Brian Palmer has pointed out in earlier publications, these are the sorts of people who are supposed to be plying their respective trades under cover of night, preferably at a far distance, and well removed from the respectable citizens of wherever it is they're living. What we don't learn from this is their names. Fanny and Lucy, undoubtedly fake names. No prostitute in Winnipeg ever used their true name, as is probably the case during this period anywhere in North America or the Western world. We don't know the background. We don't know what kind of community they came from, don't actually know what kind of community they were living in. Which gets us again to Brian Palmer's point around prostitutes, as well as others, of this ilk being described through the politics of the moment. That's it, that's all. Which gets us from the momentary discussion of the Winnipeg Press. What we know about prostitutes is not so much from the police record, it's from the stories we see in the press. And for the press, the politics of the moment in terms of prostitution and sex workers was never positive and never good. At best, you could hope for ridicule and sort of a gentle condescension. At worst, you could hope for unfettered and really nasty invective, which would make even an evangelical brimstone and fire preacher blush at the way they were described. Newspapers, of course, as Paul Rutherford has pointed out, and as you will all know better than I, were partly economic animals, and so you could not afford to alienate your clients. So prostitutes were always good press, but when the moment came for appropriate description, they would not shy away from becoming the moral authority and employing the harsher invective of people who were brazen, immoral, damnable, etc., all of which were terms that the Free Press would freely use. And not that it matters to you or that you would actually know, most of these references actually come from the Manitoba Free Press, primarily because as a proxy we're trying to find out how the paper alternately influenced or reflected what respectable Winnipeggers thought of ideas of paper that managed to survive its economic balance as well as its political patronage. It was a liberal rag for the entire period and continues to run in accordance. So other papers are used, but primarily the Free Press because it seemed to hold the balance relatively well. We'll look at three general periods here in the cycle of prostitution in Winnipeg. 1870s to about 1885, 1892 to 1904, and 1909 to 1912. It's always good to throw these dates in here somewhere. You will be tested when this is over. There were, on the technical side, we can clear up a few administrative things about prostitution in Victorian Canada, two general policy alternatives available to whatever civic government was concerned. One was segregation, one was suppression. Segregation had the advantage of it was cheap and low maintenance. You stuck them off in a red light district, made some sort of deal where they more or less stayed there. Sex workers ply their trade. You would make routine visits as a police officer to do raids on a brothel, or pullings as they were commonly known in Winnipeg. Bring them in the police court, get your regularly scheduled fine, everybody goes back, everybody's more or less happy. The problem with segregation was it never worked. There was always leakage. Prostitutes like Lucy and Fanny were always squirreling around, and opponents were always scandalized by even the whiff of sex trade going on. Nobody wanted to admit that it was happening in their own town. The alternative policy was suppression, where you clean up the brothels, shut them down, prostitutes left town, no sex trade in your town. The disadvantage of this is it also never worked. It provided temporarily and in an interim basis a clear conscience for the reformers, which in Winnipeg and elsewhere, and Valverde has done a very good job of describing this, primarily evangelical ministers and their congregations. Prostitutes never left town, they just decentralized, and they just went somewhere else, which inevitably led to more scandal, usually by the people who supported the policy in the first place, but nonetheless. At this point, if I was a better person, I'd have my one single prop, but I don't, and I don't feel like trying to draw it up. But if you can imagine 4 squiggly lines on this piece of paper, there would be a squiggly line going north, that's the Red River, muddy and kind of ugly. There would be another river going from the west, bumping into the Red River, that's the Assiniboine, also muddy and ugly. There would be 2 roads. One would go from the Assiniboine close to the Red River and go north. That's Main Street, which during the period of study, which we never discussed, 1870 to 1919, because it's Winnipeg. And most of that business district was just on Main Street there north of Portage Avenue, which is the other squiggly line that follows parallel in the same way that Main Street more or less follows the red. Portage Avenue follows the Assiniboine going west. And all the places we're about to discuss in the next 10 minutes will be plotted along one of those 2 streets. I'm just not going to do it because I don't think any of you are that interested. But technically, if you want to know, I can show you where all these brothels are being shuffled around. That's my prop. And just a note of bitterness to Sean Purdy, are you here? I never want to go to a conference where you show up with these fancy schmancy videos. Okay, moving along. 1870s to 1880s, prostitutes hung around the McDermott Flats. That would have been just up on Main Street, a little bit to the west. It was a very quiet area, the benefit of Winnipeg. Oh, I missed a very good point. Hang on, I got to back up. The point I wanted to make, man, I'm done. Here's the thing. What separates Winnipeg from most cities, when you talk about urban frontiers, you can talk about this in Paris, New York City in terms of the sex trade. You can pick almost any Western city and discuss urban frontiers, moral margins, and so on. What's a little bit different about Winnipeg was that not long beforehand, There was a frontier that was different. It was like a John Wayne frontier. Then you had the Métis, and you had the Assiniboine Indian First Nations, and you had the Sioux who beat the bejeepers out of Custer, all running around your countryside and in your farm's backyard and hanging around your barns. That was a frontier. That was back in the good old days, if you're a respectable Winnipegger, when you had trouble, you could just lay it off on the First Nations or the Métis. Were they drunk? Were they immoral? Were they causing trouble? Did they scare you? Were they militarily threatening? All their fault. It's always their fault. But as the 1870s go on, with the ending of Riel's temporary rebellion or the resistance in the Red River, Métis are slowly but steadily leaving through the 1870s. Even the Sioux have quietened down. They just want a quiet place. St. Peter's Reserve has been set up. The treaty process in Canada is well underway. And you know what happens then? Your John Wayne frontier just disappears. Now what you got left was, if you got a drunk or a thief or a prostitute or something else, you know what? Now it's your problem. These are one of your people. And by your people and on Winnipeg in this period, these are Anglo-Ontarians. So the drunks and the prostitutes, they're all forming this now new margin, new series of frontiers within the superior civilization. You can't lay it off on the defectives anymore. Now you have to take some responsibility, and that undergirds the entire orientation of this presentation. Good thing I remembered that when I did. Phew. All right, McDermott Flats, 1870, 1880s. Again, it starts off early. By this point, Winnipeggers are already fed up with prostitutes. There's complaints about flashy women coming up from Minnesota and the Dakota territories, going in cabs from saloon to saloon. They're vile characters, and they need to be taken care of. So, and the pattern we will quickly to become familiar. They are moved to Toronto Street, which is just down a little bit on Portage Avenue from Queen Street. The Free Press argued against suppression, so suppression was avoided. And here's a typical description of it. If they, as in the prostitutes, cannot be driven out or at least buried from popular view, that would be suppression, it would be as wise to overturn a heap of carrion on the prairie and scatter broadcast in the public thoroughfares as to distribute the Queen Street brothels throughout the city. This is the very early recognition that you shut down the brothels, sex trade is now all over town, and you have no idea where you're going to bump into it. And worst of all, it's not going to be in a house, it's going to be on the street. As a result, the police court and the police, the security industry in Manitoba and Winnipeg, very sympathetic to the sex trade for those pragmatic reasons, agreed that they were going to move them to Toronto Street from the McDermott Flats, move them out of town, because the handy thing about Winnipeg is it's still small, it's still growing, it's possible to have a completely open field. You can shove these people out, so you not only have a moral frontier, you got a geographic one as well. Just boot them out of town a little further out. Interestingly, police court recognized that booting people out of town in March is awkward because the prairie was indeed empty, there were no buildings, and they thought it was unfair to make these women move when it was still cold, so they gave them 3 months before the building season started, where all agreed to just be quiet. You don't apply to a sex trade, we don't go arrest you. During this period as well, as a footnote, the association familiarity with the police and the sex trade became pretty clear when Winnipeg's very first police chief, Mr. Ingram, was caught, arrested, and fired after being found very comfortably arranged in a brothel. So that was the end of his career. In 1892, this is the next cycle, here we are. This begins the longest stretch of relative moral peace between the suppressionists and the segregationists, between evangelicals and prostitutes. Again, here's the problem. The growth of the city has now moved out. It's moving west along Portage Avenue, just north along Main Street, and it's bumping into Toronto Street. So it's not necessarily that the prostitutes are making trouble, it's that respectable Winnipeg is getting in the way of the sex trade. This causes the issue. The city, for example, has grown from 16,000 to 29,000. It's doubled in trade. Sex trade has kept up with it. They have some business to do. So they move them off to Thomas Street. which is just further out. It's about a half-mile further along Portage Avenue, if you know Winnipeg. It's getting pretty close to Polo Park. It's now called Minto Street. It was renamed to sort of shed the shame of its prior history. And during this period, oddly enough, you can start seeing in the newspaper, and I am going somewhere with this because I know this is abrupt, increasing reference to black prostitutes, dusky damsels, colored women, colored damsels, darkies, colored brothels, and so on. Probably reflecting the fact that the sex trade has grown so fast, they're starting to recruit more actively from the United States, as well as perhaps from further international sources. And it's also a link, if you're thinking to yourself as respectable Winnipeg, this is now where the underworld comes in. You're now linking not only the sex trade with what we know as very seedy and unwanted immigrant population, that is blacks. Footnote here, there was a big kerfuffle over Oklahoma blacks wanting to move into Western Canada as settlers on farms. Long history, all of which you need to know. In terms of Winnipeg, it was very clear from press reports we did not like blacks in Winnipeg. When Jack Johnson beat the Great White Hope in 1910, a black man went into a bar, wanted to treat everybody in the bar, and he was thrown out and beaten up, and then subsequently arrested for making trouble amongst the whites. So this is the context of Winnipeg. Nonetheless, Police Chief McRae, the new police chief of course, picked out the spot on Thomas Street. Everybody moves in. It's good. The problem is, oh God, I'm in trouble. I'm only on page 3. I'll move along quickly. I want to pursue the race thing a little bit more. There are a lot of references to race, but here's one that really starts triggering a few things in my mind. It becomes a bit of a watershed. In 1898, ex-convict Paul Brown, black laborer from Missouri. Why he's in jail, I do not know. How long his term was, don't know that either. Don't care. He's walking out of Stony Mountain Penitentiary, just outside of Winnipeg. He's been told, when you leave penitentiary, you go straight to Thomas Street. So he goes straight to Thomas Street. His wrinkle is, he brings a gun with him. He walks into town, walks to Thomas Street, sees a man and a woman walking along the street. They're both black. And after a brief conversation, he shoots the guy dead in the head, takes a few pot shots at his wife. He takes off, hides in the nearest brothel. He puts his gun in his pocket, walks off. How nobody else heard this, I don't know. Maybe gunfire is common. Beats me, gap in the story. He finds another colored woman, follows her into an ice cream parlor, tries talking her up. She gets a bad feeling, walks out. He takes shots at her. He's not a good shot. He misses. She takes off, hides into Rosenberg's hardware store. Police arrest him. He's taken in. The guy is clearly loony. He wants to go to the North Pole with his revolver because no white men are there. He wants to make a clean job of it. He didn't want to hurt any white people. He just wanted to get all the people of his race together in one spot because he did not like them mixing with the immoral people who have fallen from grace. That is, he wanted to kill all the prostitutes and anybody associated with them. He's arrested, sentenced to death. It's commuted. Don't care. The point is, there's a couple things we can learn from this. Number one, this embeds for respectable Winnipeg everything you wanted to know about the association with prostitutes and anybody who's not white. They're all seedy. Either they're trouble or they're trouble waiting to happen. You can expect nothing good, in this case, out of blacks. The fact that you're also clearly associating with Jewish, because the Rosenberg hardware store, means you have a very unsavory lot of people growing up around this red light district. On the upside, what you also find out is a very glimpse of what you never get from the newspaper, which is a bit of the community around the red light district. They have people walking around, they're couples, they're married. The guy who was shot was black, he was a barber at a respectable hotel. The woman who dodged him actually was a cook in one of the brothels, that's where she ran for hiding for cover. But otherwise, their standard of public behavior is very close to what you would expect from anywhere else. On the upside, or what distinguishes them from the rest of Winnipeg, was a high degree, apparently, of racial and ethnic integration, which you do not see in this period in Winnipeg. And you see continuing stories after this about blacks. Blanche Moore takes Archibald Davis to court because of an assault after he asked her if her house was a coon dive. This is all just fits with what Winnipeggers thought about blacks and where they wanted to go with it. The big story comes in 1901, I'll just lump this together, 1901 to 1912, when the social evil campaign and the social reformers in Winnipeg really get a lot of muscle on their bones, and now they have authority and they have a lot of push behind them to make stuff happen. They're behind the 1904 suppression. Thomas Street resorts closed up, 12 brothels done, 84 prostitutes in jail, and fined $20 for prostitute, $40 for keepers. It's a pretty nice haul for the city. The decentralization that follows is scandalous. Even the police don't like it. They say they can't handle it. They don't have resources to take care of the sex trade. The police magistrate complains of hundreds of young girls parading the streets of the city, flaunting their morality. Citizens are worried that if we don't clean up and segregate, we're going to degrade our young girls and ruination to homes all over the city. So, Police Chief McRae, still around in his job, makes a deal with a real estate agent as well as the preeminent brothel keeper in town, Minnie Woods, also known affectionately as Queen of the Harlots, and they agree, with Minnie's approval, on where they will go next. And for the first time, the urban frontier is not further west, it actually plunges right back into the heartland, right into Point Douglas, which used to be the elite neighborhood, now it's right in the middle. It's a working class neighborhood, turns out to be the heart of Winnipeg's black community. There's a river on one side, railway tracks, noxious gas plant, and a power station. It's an industrial area, pretty unsavory. That's where they're going. Nobody talked to the residents about whether or not they wanted to be there. Suppressionists and moral reformers outrage, and by moral reformers in Winnipeg is also the primarily evangelical ministers and their supporters. Luckily this time, the suppressionists have somebody on their side. The Reverend Dr. Shearer, you may be familiar with the name, made a name for himself in 1907 by actually getting the Lord's Day Act passed in Canada. Shearer's on a tour of Western Canada for the International Purity Federation. I love these names. He takes with him a couple of purity colleagues, as they're described, as well as, unaccountably, 2 U.S. private detectives. Couldn't tell you. Back in Toronto, when he's done his tour, Shearer goes straight to the press, and this is the last time he does it, and says, the rottenest conditions of things in Winnipeg exist in connection with the question of the social vice, and it's worse than any other city in Canada. He has very little on which to basis, but it's picked up by the Toronto Press, the Star, nothing but wickedness. Again, Winnipeg is labeled the most immoral city in Canada. Massive scandal, and with very unseemly haste, Manitoba government sets up a royal commission out of nowhere. It reports in less than 2 months, exonerates all police of all charges of graft, which in fact Shearer could not himself support, and clears up everybody's name, hopefully to get Manitoba and Winnipeg off the most immoral cities in the list. And yeah, I know, Julian, I'm trying not to get you too angry. But what the Robson report, which is brief and basically unhelpful, does not show is the 800 pages of evidence that it generated. And nobody, as far as I can tell, has actually plowed through it. I am the same, I was too lazy. But what I did find out, you could count 100 men per hour going into the red light district on Thomas Street or Rachel and McFarland, which is where they eventually moved. Prostitutes, likely 1/3 French, likely 1/3 black, likely 1/3 sundry Caucasian, because in Winnipeg race was everything. You needed to know the breakdown. Interestingly, I'm going somewhere with this story, Julian, but I cannot ditch this one. Phones were installed. In 1909, the Manitoba Telephone Commission, it was a provincial commission at the time, it still is. 10 phones were installed, they made $86. Next year, 43 phones, the commission made, and this is the government of Manitoba, bear in mind, made $500. They discovered this is a real revenue source. The commission then put a minimum $10 requirement for every phone before they even empty it, so there's a minimum wage. One phone would churn out $525 per month, all on its own. Ka-ching for the Manitoba government off the sex trade. 1912, despite the fact that the Robson report was published, despite the fact that they had exonerated everybody, brothels are closed up. 54 brothels closed, that's a pretty good number. It took the entire police force that night to get it done. 175 women show up in court. They had more than $5,000 in cash on hand, not including the jewelry. Sex trade is nothing if not lucrative. And it speaks not only to the lucrativeness of the trade, but the unstated integration of this whole trade with the very formal institutions of the Manitoba and Winnipeg government. Two more things, actually 4 more things. I'm going really fast, okay? I'm going fast. I've contributed to this, and I take responsibility. I'm sorry, there's a certain exuberance associated with prostitution. It's kind of fun, kind of rowdy, make a lot of money, flashy women, and so on. Nobody gets hurt. And I have 2 responses to that. One is true, and this is how it shows up in the press. 1880, traveling evangelist makes a visit. 1880, as in 1912, when brothels are closed up in Winnipeg, the whole effing town knows. How they know, I don't know, but they know. They know to go to police court the next day because they're going to get a show. This happens in 1880. The mayor invites the evangelist, hey, there's been a polling, please come to the police court tomorrow, maybe you can have your own impromptu evangelical meeting on the side. He shows up with the Christian ladies, he watches the 24 prostitutes get fined and sentenced. He gets the floor. I don't know what the expectation was, that the women would break into tears and confess. That's not what happened. There were crowds everywhere, almost entirely of men, so far as I can tell. Laughter throughout. The newspaper was scandalized. There's a terrible exhibition of moral carrion. Those are the women. There were ribald jokes, coarse allusion, degraded crowd of lascivious men. I believe that. And it concluded, the lifeblood of our country will be poured out upon altars of human lasciviousness and damnable beastliness if this carried on. That would be the moral authority that Paul Rutherford was talking about. Okay, so that's the kind of glamorous, the patina of kind of fun, people making money, nobody getting hurt going on. Here's the less glamorous side, just sort of a quick sweep. This is what you can find in Winnipeg if you go through the papers. High rates of morphine and opium addiction amongst all prostitutes. Suicide attempts galore, some laudanum, one because of a failed attempt to leave the sex trade. Accusations of assaults among the sex trade workers between usually prostitutes and the keepers. Women were routinely held up at gunpoint, often by boyfriends and fiancés. Mary Hood was beaten to death by her laborer boyfriend. Annie Powers was found dead of a morphine overdose. Another woman died of a seizure. Shortly after Robson filed his report in 1911, this is within weeks, one woman found dead in a brothel, shot in the head, another found dead in another brothel with strangulation. It was not a pretty industry, and I apologize for contributing to that, but just a heads up for the rest of us. The cost in life echoed, I don't mean to trivialize this, the cost in economics. In Winnipeg, never a conversation about single women's wages when there wasn't a discussion. Unsaid, unspoken, giant elephant in the room about what this meant for why women were entering the sex trade. Nobody ever said anything about that. You can go to Carolyn Strange, she's done a wonderful job of analyzing this. Exactly the same thing in Winnipeg. The Voice was the first labor paper in Winnipeg, and in 1898 it said boldly, if we paid women more, we didn't pay them $1 every 3 weeks, we probably wouldn't have a prostitution problem, wouldn't we? Council wouldn't have to argue whether it was going to do segregation or suppression. 1904, the Free Press starts running a women's column on economics and the single wage, and they had letters galore, and everybody talked about in gruesome detail food, dress, how is a woman going to attract a man without looking decent, how are you going to pay for lunch, where are you going to live, what kind of area are you going to have to live in order to afford it on this wage. Nobody talked about sex. Nobody talked about prostitution or the link. So, the final 2 things, and I'll be fast. I know I'm a liar already, but here we go. With the closure in 1912, it's not the failure of the moral frontier, but it is the failure of the geographic frontier of the moral margin in Winnipeg for the sex trade. It's done during this period. Nobody ever opens up again. I don't actually know what happens in the 20s and 30s. But certainly just during this period, it's finished. But in terms of the wages, there's 2 more things I want to talk about and what the result was of this. Number 1, 1917, telephone operators go on strike. If you happen to know what happened in the 1907 Bell telephone operator strike in Toronto, see Carolyn Strange, identical. Not that I would ever think of cutting and pasting and ripping off Carolyn Strange. I would never think of her even do that, but you could, because almost to the letter, this is what happened. The operators went on strike, it dragged on, provincial government promised a formal inquiry, they get it. Interviews go on for 1 week, all the testimony all around the single wage and the sex trade. Nobody talks about it till finally, after day number 7 of the examinations, woman cracked and said this has been going on for years. Women leave even temporarily to join the sex trade because they need the money. And all hell breaks loose. There's newspapers, there's outrage. I can only imagine what happened to this poor woman that night, because the next morning she's reported in the newspapers recanting everything I was wrong, I was mistaken, I was misunderstood, and so on. But the damage would have been done. It was very clear. And the Manitoba Telephone Commission, which is not its real name, that's its current one, the Telephone Commission was shamed on account of this into giving the women what they had wanted. It was the first time that publicly in the mainstream press the link was made firmly. Not long after, I'm sure just purely coincidentally, a minimum wage was set up especially for women. During that commission investigation, one of the female investigators went to a nameless Manitoba factory undercover to see what conditions were like, and she had to take the next week off for illness because she couldn't take one shift at one day at one work at one factory. The other thing I wanted to talk about, what happens when you close and you get decentralization. 1918, there's another Royal Commission because another Fanny gets arrested, definitely not her name, for plying her trade on the streets of Winnipeg, not in a brothel, on the streets now, along with her cab driver boyfriend who facilitated a lot of the work, Solly. I can't even make this stuff up. So Solly and Fanny are in court and they immediately say, this is all part of extortion. I got to pay $100 a week to the lawyers who then distributes it among police officers. Scandal erupts, Royal Commission, another justice takes charge. He, like his predecessor, exonerates everybody of everything because he dismissed all evidence because it's by people who are of uncertain moral character and he doesn't need to listen to it. So basically every piece of evidence was thrown out. Prostitutes are now everywhere. What do you take from this if you're a respectable Winnipegger? Who am I talking to when I pick up the phone and talk to the operator? Is this an operator? Is this a half-time prostitute? Casual? Is this woman pure or is she in the process of falling? For a respectable Winnipegger, your whole scale is now thrown off. Your frontier is now all over the place. The second one has been a technical shift. Fanny Cooper came into town as a Jewish immigrant from Europe. This is the first time you get a hint that the sex trade in Winnipeg has an international flavor beyond the United States. And her contact throughout and her rise from poverty to the heights of Winnipeg sex trade was facilitated by a series of Jewish men. So again, it's not the traditional female keeper, it's not Dolly Parton on the Texas prairie anymore. Now you've got men involved, and just like Selin did with South Africa and his kind of weird book on who Jack the Ripper is, there's a very strong international component. That's just a technical note on what seemed to be happening to prostitution in Winnipeg. So as the judge said, in terms of the second one, when you get into a cab, who do you know where you're going? If you call a cab for your daughter, your wife, your son, your young boys, how do you know what's going to happen to them? Well, this is the answer, you don't know. And that's just the way it's going to be. Past 1912, gunfire, riots, there's non-stop kerfuffle. From Charleswood in the west to Transcona in the east, riots, assaults just run amok. Soon after Robson filed his report, 6 officers fired for faking brothel closures, 2 more officers fired for being caught drinking in brothels, and so on. By conclusion, there's a number of things. I'm almost done. I know these are the words you've been waiting to hear. Number 1, you get a constant reminder of what white, respectable women were supposed to aspire to and what they were not to aspire to. Prostitutes are very handy for that. Doesn't matter if they got brothels or standing on the street. See that? Don't do that. This is not what you're supposed to be like. They're very good for that. Doesn't matter what the invective says. Don't believe in the press. They're lying on that part. Prostitutes are very handy. In fact, I would go as far as to say it was necessary. It'd be a real bummer if the prostitutes weren't there, if the sex trade was muted and disappeared. You got another problem. Who's going to be your foil? Who's going to be your public counterpart? You don't have one. But you can always have the prostitutes. Number 2, note the political economy, the link between the sex trade and what goes on in city council and the police and the parental telephone commission. These people were wealthy. Brothels were never moved without the police chief first consulting some agreed upon representative on behalf of the prostitutes. Nowhere else in Winnipeg were people consulting female owners of businesses on where relocation policy should go. It's kind of a trite way to put it, but nonetheless, there you have it. Number 3, you get prostitutes as this agent for showing one of those many fundamental contradictions of capitalism. On the one hand, you want your women to have sexual propriety, morally upright, you want them to be well dressed, you want them to be proper wives and mothers. On the other hand, you want cheap labor, cheap uniforms, cheap garment workers, and clothing. So what are you going to do with those two? Not very much. You might come up with a minimum wage, but that's a fundamental contradiction never resolved in Winnipeg during this period. We've already talked about the collapse of the geographic frontier. What does this mean for Winnipeg? Well, it's Winnipeg and we're now approaching 1919, so I cannot not say it. By now, Winnipeg is busy. It's this deep in World War I. Still lots of anxiety. 1917 was not a good year for the Allies. They don't turn the corner until the next year, and even then nobody knows the corner's turned until it's all over. And the other thing, they got other problems on their mind. You know what? The political economy of prostitutes was pretty tame compared to the political economy of those seedy immigrants, many of whom we were introduced through the sex trade. What they were doing in Winnipeg during this period, a lot of Reds, a lot of socialists, a lot of anarchists going on, lots of foreign-born workers of foreign languages talking things you don't want to hear. And you got workers who are getting increasingly militant. In 1918, they have their first general strike. By the time Solly and Fanny were in jail for their accusations of graft, that first labor action is just around the corner. That's what Winnipeg's worried about. That's why prostitution takes a back seat. The margin is not irrelevant. The margin is useful for good and bad reasons. Nobody ever admitted it. And that's Winnipeg prostitution in the press, 1880, 1919. Very sorry.